Welcome everyone to what is now the third seminar in this year's monthly sign-up series. It's a series that went into lockdown between February and May, but it's now roaring back with a full program for the rest of the year. I'll start, as we always do, by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal people on whose traditional lands those of us who are in Canberra live and are meeting today, and pay our respect to the community's elders and leaders, past, present and emerging. We're delighted to have as our speaker today, philosopher of science Adrian Curry from the University of Exeter. The ANU happily claims Adrian as a graduate, having gained, I think, his PhD here working with Kim Sterelny. Adrian ranges very widely across what he calls the historical disciplines, which is all those disciplines that have pretensions to historical explanation, including history, archaeology, paleontology, and the various evolutionary sciences, seeking and often finding, I think, surprising concordance amongst their different strategies, however explicit or implicit these might be. He's got 2 books out recently, both of which I can strongly recommend. Rock, Bone and Ruin, An Optimist's Guide to the Historical Sciences, published in 2018, and Scientific Knowledge in the Deep Past, published just last year. But some will know his work on the use of ethnographic analogy in archaeology and on the comparative method more generally. My personal favourite is his co-authored book with Kim Sterelny, in co-authored paper, that is, in defense of storytelling. But I'm also very keen to read his forthcoming paper on Kon-Tiki experiments. So Adrian's paper today is titled Speculation Made Material, Experimental Archaeology and Maker's Knowledge. And Adrian, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you. I will see if I can share my screen correctly. Like so. Now hopefully the slideshow will begin. There it goes. Thanks, it's a real delight to be here. I'm going to try and talk about some new work on experimental archaeology. So maybe a good start is to ask, what is archaeology? Well, here's a good sort of first pass. Humans are messy. We leave stuff all over the place, and that stuff we can use to find out about the humans. So we're going to talk a little bit today about stuff like lithic tools. Humans make tools out of stone, those get into the ground, archaeologists dig them up and then use them as ways of finding out about the past. That's a pretty reasonable first pass about what you're doing when you're an archaeologist. You're looking at the material record that humans have left behind as an inroads into their past lives and cultures and technologies. But that's not the only material objects that archaeologists spend a lot of time thinking about. They also spend a lot of time doing what is often called experimental archaeology. So here we have 2 people making lithic stone tools. So here, instead of looking at stone tools that our ancestors have made, they're instead making their own tools. Why would you go about doing that? Well, really, there are 2 kinds of answers. One answer is quite nicely captured by this quote from Francois Bourdes, a sort of quite famous, very successful French archaeologist of his time, who was a very famously skillful flint knapper. So he was very good at building these stone tools. Here he's describing what it's like at archaeology conferences, where some of the archaeologists are experienced flint knappers and some are not. In Francois' view, those who are not experienced are lacking something. So he says, no publication, no conference, and no movie will ever replace the actual production by the archaeologists themselves of the tools they are studying. When compared to skilled knappers, it's much more difficult to pass knowledge on to archaeologists who had never, or almost never, taken a hammerstone or an antler in their hands. I feel them more than I see them. So the idea is something like it's sort of a tacit kind of knowledge as opposed to sort of explicit kind of knowledge. I suspect the flint knapping will have to become a necessary part of the training of any archaeologist interested in prehistory. So Bourdes is saying something like this: what you get from experimental archaeology, what you get from, for instance, learning how to do stone knapping, is a kind of embodied know-how. But that's not the way that archaeologists often talk about experimental archaeology. If you go and read sort of papers on it, reflections, introductions to collected volumes, they'll often really emphasize this experiment aspect. They'll say what you're doing when you're doing experimental archaeology is you're testing archaeological hypotheses. And these things are not sort of immediately in tension, but they are very different ways of thinking about experimental archaeology. And my job today is to try and give a philosophical account of how these two roles work together and interplay. So in a sense, I'm giving a kind of defense of experimental archaeology, although, to be honest, it's a little bit unclear why it would need a defense, but I find it interesting anyway. So philosophically speaking, what I'm interested in understanding are the epistemic goods of experimental archaeology. So what does that mean? An epistemic good we might think of as something like truth or justified belief. And I think it's fair to say that traditionally, philosophers have focused on a very few number of these, like truth and justified belief. And I think it's also fair to say that in the last 10 years, we philosophers of science have been trying to expand this. We've been trying to talk about a wider range of things. This is mostly shown in a real focus on understanding these days. And so I'm seeing myself as part of this tradition. I'm trying to expand how we think about knowledge. And I think experimental archaeology is a fantastic place to look for that. So I'm going to argue that, yes, indeed, experimental archaeology is a great way of testing archaeological hypotheses. I'm going to argue a very particular type of hypothesis, as we'll see. But I'm also going to argue that they generate something called maker's knowledge. And I think maker's knowledge is critically important for allowing archaeologists to partake in a certain tradition, to understand and critique various archaeological hypotheses, theories, and so forth. But they also allow them to generate kind of integrated explanations. I'm going to argue that at least sometimes this kind of maker's knowledge well positions you to integrate various aspects of the archaeological record. Finally, I'm going to turn to this notion of speculation made material. I'm going to argue that we can understand experimental archaeology as a mode of speculation, which I think looks quite different to what at least philosophers and some other people have said when they're thinking about creativity in science and speculation in science. So, what's my structure? I'm going to start focusing on that hypothesis stuff. I'm going to start by saying experimental archaeology fits into a relatively simple model of historical reasoning called trace-based reasoning. So I'm going to fit it into that. I'm then going to turn into two kind of worries. One worry is particular to experimental archaeology. This is Martin Bell's concerns about Xeroxing. The other is a more general issue with archaeology, which is that in order to analyze archaeological data, I need to decontextualize it, isolate it from the context in which it was extracted and, transformed. But archaeological explanation is fundamentally holistic and integrative. So there's a question about how I bring those two things together. So I'll present those two challenges. I'll then turn to maker's knowledge, and I'll draw some work from some philosophers to give what I take to be a relatively thin, relatively easy to work with notion of maker's knowledge. With that in hand, we'll turn to a case study. I'll have a look at some recent work by Deborah Olesen on medieval Scandinavian flint knapping, and I'll use that to sort of illustrate how seeing experimental archaeology in terms of maker's knowledge can help us solve these worries about Xeroxing and integration. With that in place, I'll turn to speculation. So as you can see, it's going to be a pretty hefty talk. I'll see you on the other side. A few apologies. As I said, I'm going through quite a lot of stuff here. There are some things I'm going to have to outright ignore. One is that experimental archaeology is an extraordinarily diverse practice, both in terms of the practices themselves. I'm going to be focusing on flint knapping, effectively hitting a rock with another rock in a very, very skilled, careful way. But other sorts of experimental archaeology include reconstructing boats, reconstructing buildings, learning sort of basket weaving and sewing techniques. There's an extraordinarily diverse array of different practices that fall under this umbrella of experimental archaeology. Further, experimental archaeology is done for many different functions. I'm going to be focusing on it in a, if you want, kind of scientific context. I'm interested in how experimental archaeology feeds into archaeological science. But often experimental archaeology is used in pedagogical contexts. So here at the University of Exeter, experimental archaeology is part of their sort of undergraduate program, and they think that's very important. Also in outreach, you find it in open door museums, there's a lot of experimental archaeology. I'm just going to be focusing on the sciencey stuff. So sorry about that. The second apology, archaeological theory is rich, heterogeneous, and often extremely dense. And I'm often not the best at navigating it. And so my strategy for this talk is to just kind of ignore it. I'm very happy to talk about it during question time. There are very particular figures who I think say things which interestingly overlap. So Tim Ingold's work is a very obvious example, but I'm going to just stick to the philosophy. My hope is that my way in and the tools I'm using to talk about experimental archaeology are so different that they'll provide a kind of complementary kind of stuff to archaeological discussions. That's my hope. Okay, what's trace-based reasoning? Well, it's fairly straightforward. When you're interested in discovering the past, if you're a detective or if you're a paleontologist, archaeologist, geologist, cosmologist, your primary bit of evidence are traces, things that are left hanging around from the past. These traces are related in some way to various past events, usually via some causal dependency. So how that past event turned out made a difference to how that trace turned out. And in virtue of us understanding those things, we're able to make inferences to the past. Very, very straightforward. Notice that in this model, there are two types of hypotheses. There are hypotheses pertaining to past events themselves, right? Such and such happened in the past. But there are also hypotheses about those causal dependencies. Events of that type of event leaves traces with these kinds of features. So we have a hypothesis about the event in the past, and we have what is sometimes called an auxiliary hypothesis, which captures how sort of temporal processes lead from past events to currently observable traces. So for example, this is an example pretty much owed to Benjafars. You have a past event such as butchering some animal. We have a current trace, which is some very distinctive cut marks on some fossils or some bones. What do I need to do in order to connect these two things? Well, I need to know that those cut marks are what I should expect if some hominids have butchered a carcass. How do I find that out? Well, I need to know that events of that type leave traces with those features. And experimental archaeology is a great way of doing that. I can get some simulacra of some lithic tools, and I can carve up a carcass, and I can look at the distinctive marks that are left and see if they match. And so we can think about experimental archaeology in a kind of hypothesis testing mode by thinking about what traces past events would leave via constructing analogues or simulacra of those and then manipulating and experimenting upon them. And so that's what I think is a sort of good story about what you're doing when you're doing experimental archaeology and testing hypotheses. Note, of course, that this doesn't cover every type of experimental activity that archaeologists do, but it covers what I think is often meant when they refer to experimental archaeology. And so I think these practices are critical. They play an incredibly important role because provisioning those regularities required to link the past to the present is a sort of central and crucial part of what makes archaeology powerful and what makes it interesting. So let's raise some problems. Right? It's very standard. If you're a philosopher, you've got to have some things to push back against. One of these worries I'm taking from Martin Bell, who has some really interesting discussions about some of the foibles around experimental archaeology. The one that he focuses on is this notion of xeroxing. And here's one way of putting it. When you're doing experimental archaeology, you're often not reconstructing something that you found on your site. You're rather borrowing tools and techniques that other archaeologists have developed to build that tool, right? So when I'm building a lithic tool, what I don't do is go and grab a lithic tool from the ground. What I do is I guess go on YouTube or go to a workshop or go and hang out with a lithic stonemaker, and they show me how to do it. And so there's this, Martin worries that there's this decoupling between the experimental practice and then the particular features of the site. The other worry, and this is not specific to experimental archaeology, but I think maker's knowledge can really help us think about it, is this sort of feature of archaeological analysis that involves abstracting or isolating it from a site, but whereas your explanations, your archaeological interpretations are integrated and holistic. And so how do you move from decontextualized evidence to contextualized integrated explanations? So let's move through these quickly. So, as I've just said about this notion of xeroxing, I might make a reconstruction of some object based on a particular site. I then have an archaeologist at another site, and they reconstruct my reconstruction. what might be problematic about this? Well, one thing that's problematic is that the site might have particular features. It might have idiosyncratic features that are just not captured by me reconstructing that. And so if archaeological traditions and cultures and technologies are heterogeneous, then Xeroxing might obscure those differences. The second problem, I think, is captured by Alison Wiley's notion of vertical independence. So remember, we have these two different types of hypotheses: the hypothesis about the particular event and the hypothesis about the regularities. If those two hypotheses rely on the same evidence, if there's just a single point or a single set of points that these two are both drawing on, then that's going to be epistemically problematic. There's going to be a kind of epistemic circularity within it. And I think Martin's worry captures both of these things. So his example is Reynolds roundhouses. So Reynolds in the 60s and 70s, I think, started constructing these roundhouses in the UK, and this started this rather flourishing sort of research tradition. He says that they've been very successful, maybe too successful, because most others who build these roundhouses are simply Xeroxing. They're just using the same techniques. In Britain, he points out, 61 experimental roundhouses have been constructed on 32 different sites. The vast majority have been Xeroxing the principles developed by Reynolds at Butser. And so this is a kind of set of, I think, roughly two problems that can come from the formation of an experimental tradition. The first are failures of vertical independence. So the hypothesis you're testing, say that a particular technique was used in a particular site, and the hypotheses which facilitate those tests, something like, oh, the building technique of that type leaves traces with these properties, are not independent in a good way. And it potentially misses local peculiarity. If past material and cultural practices are heterogeneous, then Xeroxing might obscure those differences. Now, Bell has really nice things to say about what to do in light of these kinds of worries. In particular, he sort of urges a focus more on the particular site that you're on. And also, I hope it's kind of obvious that neither of these problems are ones which experimental archaeology necessarily has. They're things that can be overcome. And indeed, when we move to the Swedish daggers section, I'll sort of give you a sense of how maker's knowledge help us do that. The second problem is really a sort of fundamental epistemic situation that runs throughout archaeology, which is just this. If you're an archaeologist, you've got to dig something out of the ground. So you have to make decisions about what to dig, how to get it out of the ground, and what information to record about where the thing was, how deep it was, what other things were around it. And you're not going to be able to save everything or record everything. You're then going to have to store stuff. You have to catalog it. You have to make it retrievable in various ways. You can do that in analog ways, in electronic ways, digital ways rather, and it's always going to be complicated and difficult. And then when you do analyses, you're further isolating and decontextualizing that object from the context in which it was generated. And yet, as an archaeologist, what you want to understand are human lifeways, the cultures of the past. And it's unclear how you get to that holistic, integrated understanding from these isolated, highly abstracted bits of data. And so the problem of integration is just archaeological work decontextualizes or fragments, in Jones's terms, material remains from their deposition, right? So this process of extraction, cataloging, and material analysis loses information and gives you isolation. But archaeological interpretation is holistic and integrated. So how do you do it? What I'm going to argue is, first, if we understand experimental archaeology in terms of maker's knowledge in the sense I'll describe it, this gives us a sunnier conception of Xeroxing. We get to say, Bell's right that we need to make some changes to how we behave in virtue of Xeroxing, but Xeroxing nonetheless is actually an important aspect of experimental archaeology. And we're able to show, or hopefully be able to show, that the maker's knowledge we get from experimental archaeology is a critical tool for getting to those holistic, integrated explanations and interpretations. So to do that, of course, I have to say a little bit about what maker's knowledge is. Maker's knowledge is, in some sense, about know-how. It's about you bringing about the thing that you have knowledge of, as opposed to watching someone else do it or maybe hearing someone else do it. And so the idea is there's supposed to be something special about someone who creates or brings about the thing, as opposed to an observer or someone who hears by testimony. Discussions of maker's knowledge really are centered often in the early modern period, where you have various folks like Vico saying something like this: hey, look, we're not going to be able to have certain understanding of nature because we didn't make nature. Well, God made nature. This is a way of thinking about maker's knowledge in terms of you getting a special type of content. There are some things you can learn through maker's knowledge which you simply cannot learn other ways. Another way, I think a much weaker way of thinking about maker's knowledge, is to think about having special, better access to content. Here the idea is not that there are things that are special types of knowledge that you only know if you are a maker. Rather, if you make something that gives you good access, it's a good way of finding out that kind of knowledge. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I like this latter way of thinking about maker's knowledge much more than the former way of thinking about it. And one way of getting at it is just to appeal to this sort of nice point that Maureen O'Malley makes in a discussion a wee while ago now. She says, look, astrophysicists have considerable understanding of the physical characteristics of faraway galaxies despite the inability to reconstruct them materially. Biologists appear to understand a great deal about biological systems, even when they merely observe and experiment rather than construct them de novo. It seems like the idea that needing to build something is necessary for certain types of knowledge just doesn't seem to track scientific practice. Another worry with this kind of, with going this special kind of knowledge debate is it leads you down what I consider to be rather arcane philosophical mazes, right? Discussions of, well, what kind of special knowledge is this? How can I articulate it? Now, some people are very good at having those kinds of discussions. I'm very bad at having those kinds of discussions and frankly find them pretty unhelpful for my kind of task, which is understanding the knowledge that science generates. And so the second way of going suits me much better. And happily, there's a sort of recent paper, quite a nice one by Luciano Floridi, which is interested in analyzing maker's knowledge in those terms. Now, I'm going to kind of grab what I want from Floridi's account. Hopefully, were he to watch this, he wouldn't be too upset by my doing that. But if you'd like me to discuss more carefully the kind of view he's developing, I'm happy to do that in question time. At base, what Floridi's interested in is, again, what is different between the person who builds, makes something, someone who observes something, and something who hears about something, who gets sort of testimony. Instead of asking, will they have different types of knowledge? The question instead is, what account can they give of their knowledge? Compare myself to an experienced flint napper. I've hit two rocks together, but I have not flint napped by any means. You can tell me and teach me things about flint napping, right? Researching this paper involved me learning about what, say, negative scarring is and getting confused about what a core is and how I might recognize that given its negative scarring. So I can, talk about what negative scarring is in virtue of the texts I've read, the pictures I've looked at. Those are how I have an account of my knowledge insofar as it is knowledge. By comparison, someone who's in fact flint napped has done it. Their account of their knowledge about, at least partially, of negative scarring is, I chipped off a bit and there was some negative scarring. That's a different kind of account for Floridi. The way he captures it is like this. He's talking about Alice, this kind of toy builder, maker. She says, well, Alice, as opposed to the observer or the hearer, is part of the system. She's part of the source of that systemic behavior. She holds the information piece, the knowledge she's got, as part of the system that brings about that state. It follows that the maker's knowledge is knowledge of a system from within, not from without. Now, Floridi wants to make some big conceptual moves with this. I want to go somewhere a little bit simpler. I want to instead ask the following question about making versus observing, which is just, how does making something well position me to learn something? Right? Let's put some philosophy on that sentence. We might say this: an epistemological process, some process of learning, well positions some agent towards some knowledge, just in case engaging in that process makes it more likely that the agent will learn that knowledge compared to relative alternative epistemic processes. There's some dense philosophy for you. What does that mean? Well, it's just this. Compare again myself to the experienced flint napper, and imagine we want to teach something to me and the flint napper about flint, about stone tools, about lithic artifacts. It seems like, at least for some types of knowledge, the flint napper, because of their experience of building building lithic tools, are going to be better at learning that than I am. They're going to pick it up more quickly. That seems plausible. right? And so in that case, it well positions them to get that knowledge. And so my question then is, what kind of knowledge does experimental archaeology well position us for, right? If you're doing experimental archaeology, what do you learn? And I think a very immediate kind of answer comes to mind, which is, well, embodied know-how. Like Boards was saying, right? If you do experimental archaeology, you get to kind of have a sort of tacit understanding of how this stuff works and how to build it. So to move on then, we need to talk a little bit about the notion of embodied knowledge. Now, as you might know or can probably imagine, there's a huge discussion on embodied knowledge. What I'm going to do is grab an account I like and I'm going to run with it. Happy to talk about other accounts in question. What is this account? Well, this account is Josiah Sutton's, and it really starts with a very, very common and very sort of in some ways problematic distinction between episodic and procedural memory. Very approximately, episodic memory is memory of particular events. It's sort of, in some sense, kind of propositional and explicit. So as I'm doing a seminar, I might call to mind other seminars I've done. I might imagine various disasters. I might imagine great triumphs, or rather mundane talks, so on and so forth. By comparison, procedural memory is more like a kind of habit. It's the memory that I have through gaining expertise in certain types of skills. So when I'm doing a seminar, I'm often presenting in various ways. I'm talking at a particular pace. I'm moving my hands in various ways. I'm using the slides in various ways. Often this is sort of more procedural than episodic. I'm not explicitly thinking about what I'm doing. I'm rather riding along, as it were, the habitus that have built up over years and years and years of doing this type of talk. Now, lots to be said about episodic and procedural memory. What Sutton is interested in hitting is this notion that expert skill is really focused on procedural memory. There's this very common idea that when you're an expert doing your skill, you're kind of switching off your sort of propositional part of your brain. You're just sort of acting automatically. You're letting that build-up habitus do work for you. And Sutton's point is that can't be right. And he does this by appealing to cricket. So this is maybe the first philosophy talk that has talked about experimental archaeology via a discussion of cricket, and I'm happy about that. So think about the experienced cricket batsperson. If you're, about to hit the ball, you're watching the bowler sort of run towards you, you're checking out where the other fielders are, you're planning. You're not simply acting automatically. And what's critical about this planning is that the planning is sensitive to what happens during the procedure. It's going to turn on the way the ball bounces, what type of spin it turns out to have. Maybe some of the fielders move. I don't actually know that much about cricket. I don't know if the fielders move. But if they do, that would be something you'd be sensitive to. And so as this sort of event unfolds, as your expert performance unfolds, how you behave is responding intelligently to what else is going on. And so Sutton puts it, experts, people like expert batsmen, people require their embodied routines to be continually sensitive to these varying conditions. So they must have learned to influence themselves. Intelligent action must be flexible. And so if we're thinking about expert skill, right, this embodied expert skill, it's a combination of your sort of habitus and your more sort of episodic kind of ways of thinking. And I think this sort of model fits beautifully with flint knapping. Flint knapping is extraordinarily difficult. It takes a long time to learn, and it's very, very, very hard to do. It looks plausible that flint knapping is a complex, dynamic skill that involves integrating both these bodily learned habits, the procedural stuff, and a kind of probing awareness of how the task is unfolding, the episodic stuff. So it's a form of regulated improvisation, right? As well as a dynamic interceptive action, as Sutton would put it. Whew, okay. So thus far, I've given us two challenges we want experimental archaeology to overcome. One is the challenge of Xeroxing. Hey, you're just building someone else's tool. Another is integration. How are you going to get those things together? What I've then done is given us an account of first maker's knowledge and then the type of maker's knowledge we get from experimental archaeology like lithic stone tool construction, namely this kind of dynamic embodied expert skill. What I want to do now is switch to a case study, which I'm going to discuss in a very kind of casual sort of way, but I'm going to use that to draw out some lessons which connect this notion of embodied skill and maker's knowledge and show how it can partially overcome Xeroxing and integration. That's my plan. So here is what's often called a Swedish dagger. These are built in medieval Scandinavia, and they're considered to be pretty damn fancy by flint knappers. They're often sort of discussed in almost kind of mystic ways. It's the sort of Shangri-La of flint napping, right? So modern flint knappers, you know, if you can build one of these, you're the top. Discussions of medieval stone tools are actually remarkably similar in lots of ways to discussions of stone tools in, say, the Paleolithic or Pleistocene. There's still this problem of there being too many of them and they're being too well made, right? So if you go back to the Pleistocene, there's lots of stone tools, way more than you need, and a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are way too well made, which leads to these questions about, well, how did they function? Is there some kind of ritualistic purpose? Are they using sort of as symbols of authority or status? Are they being used with burial? Do they have some spiritual connection, right? They're not just being used for cutting. And so what could they be used for? Similarly, in the medieval world, you see, it's medieval Scandinavia, you see similar problems. And then, of course, there are questions about the actual production. In the medieval context, we have questions about, well, was everyone building daggers? Were skilled artisans doing daggers? Did we have guilds? Did we have sort of the Swedish dagger guild as, you know, and what sort of power did they have in society? And so on and so forth. Hard things to try and get information about. Deborah Olson has this really nice recent paper where she draws on work from modern flint knappers. She looks at various aspects of how modern flint knappers do their business, and she uses that to try and answer some of those questions. So she says, contemporary knappers measure their skills against those of prehistoric makers of flint knappers. Many of these have high aesthetic qualities, but also there are lots of mediocre and ugly daggers lining museum shelves. The point that Olson's making here is twofold. One is that flint knappers have aesthetic judgments about flints, about tools, and they make these judgments based on the skill that they've kind of learned. Second, not all of these daggers are good. There's lots of daggers, only some of them are super, super fancy. And so here we have an array of daggers from fancy to not fancy, from well-made to not very well-made, based on the kind of judgments that modern flint knappers make. Hopefully it's pretty obvious which end is the well-made end and which end is the not well-made end. What Olson does is she looks at the judgments that these flint knappers are making, and from that extracts a series of measurements. So based on those judgments, she builds various measures of dagger quality. You can kind of imagine what they're going to be. It's going to be things like number of strokes detectable on the stone, something about symmetry, so on and so forth. So she has 3 or 4 of these kind of matrices. And then she uses that to analyze about, I think it's over 500 of these Scandinavian daggers from around about the same time. What she discovers is that there's lots of variation in quality within dagger types. There are 4 or 5 dagger types, but not across daggers. So all the different types of daggers are being made, and they're all being made to varying degrees of skill, which Olson takes to suggest that everyone's making daggers. This is a society where making daggers is just a thing you do. Your mum or dad does it around the fire when you're 3. She then looks at contemporary napper practices, looks at how long it takes a napper to build a tool, and uses that to estimate how much time would be required to just construct all of those daggers, right? And so what she learns from this is that, well, production volumes do not speak of mass production or dagger factories churning out large numbers of standardized products. Nor do we have any real archaeological evidence for daggers works or anything like that. There's no demand for large numbers of professionally made daggers. And so basically there are lots of daggers for sure, but there aren't so many, nor would they take so long to build, that you'd need to have a kind of dedicated factory style production. So what is going on then? Who is building these very, very fancy daggers? Olson draws on sort of 2 contemporary models. One is a cabinet maker, I think named Mark, who's a passionate amateur who just makes cabinets because he damn well loves to make cabinets. You know, he's very, very good at it. He does it for the love. compared to a sort of a professional flint knapper, so someone who is paid to do this. And she wants to suggest that actually Mark is the better model for what's going on in medieval Scandinavia. She says, I suggest that Mark, striving for artistic excellence and driven by a personal sense of satisfaction, but not making a living, might be a better model for the makers of the finest late Neolithic daggers. As people sharing a lithic habitus, in other words, everyone's building daggers, all members of late Neolithic society were able to knack flint, at least at some level of skill. The poor and mediocre daggers suggest that large numbers of individuals made them, although with varying degrees of success. If I was trying to make the daggers, they would be pretty shit. A few individuals were particularly talented and particularly interested, and when they had time on their hands, they experimented with flint. And so it's this kind of, it's a very sort of heartwarming sort of picture of how these specialized daggers are being made. Now, I'm not interested in whether Olison's final conclusion is right or not. What I'm interested in is the role that the embodied knowledge of modern flint knappers played in her work. And you'll note that my argument doesn't turn on whether or not Olison herself has in fact done any flint knapping. I suspect she has, but I don't know. Here's what has happened. Here's how I would structure this. We've got a community of practice building this embodied expert skill. You've got folks who are building these very fine Swedish daggers. From that, we're able to extract these quantified measures, right? This is the community of practice is forming a kind of resource that we're able to abstract things and build these quantified measures. And it's those measures that we then apply to the material record. If you're thinking about experimental archaeology in terms of hypothesis testing, we might start worrying about xeroxing because we don't have independence between the various types of hypotheses we're using. But if you're thinking of it as a resource of embodied skill, it's a thing we can draw information from, then suddenly it's not a hypothesis. And so the xeroxing worry doesn't hit in quite the same way. And so with hypothesis testing, with Xerox, we start worrying about independence and heterogeneity. But if this is maker's knowledge, if we have a community of practice which is well placed to build these quantified measures, then actually we have a very different perspective on Xeroxing. Now, it doesn't follow from this that the worries that Bell raises aren't serious worries, but I think it allows us to see that this practice of Xeroxing is simply part of being part of an experimental tradition. It's very important. What about integration? Well, note that the final picture that Olison gives us is very, very rich. We have a picture of a society where folks just kind of make daggers, right? That's what you do in your society. Maybe the same way we play computer games. I've got no idea. And there are some people who are very, very good at building daggers, just like, I guess, there are some people who are very, very good at playing computer games or making cabinets. And they start doing that. With her explanation, we move from a bunch of these isolated daggers that are just thought of as these aesthetic isolated objects, might be analyzed in these abstract quantified ways like Olison does, but then we're able to bring them back into an integrated explanation. Part of the story, it seems to me, is her capacity to engage with the sort of embodied expert knowledge and skill that the flint knappers have. It would be hard to imagine this kind of explanation being come up with and then being tested without access to those kinds of communities. And so, in addition to hypothesis testing, experimental archaeology does this business of forming communities of expert skill. Xeroxing can actually be understood as a way of facilitating that. Xeroxing is inevitable if you're going to have that type of community. That expertise is critical for developing those measurable tests, right? It plays a direct role into the science of experimental archaeology. And it well places archaeologists to develop these integrated explanations. So finally, I want to spend a few minutes talking about speculation. I want to make my sort of final punch about the nature of experimental archaeology and why it should be interesting to philosophers. When philosophers and others have thought about speculation, it's very, very much been in a abstract, theoretical kind of way. So first, speculation is often analyzed in terms of being a hypothesis. A speculative hypothesis is a hypothesis where the evidence outruns, where the hypothesis outruns the evidence. It's not justified for belief or something, but instead it's justified pragmatically. It's a good hypothesis to put on the table because it's going to be productive. The second is that speculation is often thought of in theoretical or imaginative kinds of terms. So someone like Wilhelm Whewell in the late 19th century said things like, well, science really starts with a happy thought. And happy thoughts, of course, it's the 19th century, are going to be had by brilliant geniuses. And then the process of science is sort of articulating and making explicit and measurable those happy thoughts. In the early 20th century, you had people like Peirce saying things like, oh, well, if you want to be a good speculator, if you want to be a good abductive scientist, it's all about preparing the mind. It's about having the mind ready and open to having these thoughts come in. And I'm sure that speculation operates like that quite often. I think with experimental archaeology, we see something different. I think we see speculation made material. What do I mean by that? Well, by made material, I mean two things. The first is in reference to John Norton's work on the justification of induction. If you're Norton, you think that the justification of some inference, some induction, is found in local facts, as opposed to that induction fitting within some abstract argument schema. So, Bayesian statistics, if you want. Right? So the idea is things like Bayesian statistics only work because the sort of contextual factors, the facts on the ground, allow them to work. Similarly, I think when we're looking at the sort of speculative strategies adopted in experimental archaeology, it's not that there's some it's not that there's some sort of set of psychological heuristics or some logic of discovery, which is saying what is a good speculative move or not. It's rather the materials and the context that the archaeologist is working within. More importantly, the second sense of material is the idea that the space which is being searched within, the space that we're interested in, is delineated by physical or material systems, not by, say, concepts or theories or imagination. So a very common way of thinking about creativity and speculation is in terms of a sort of search space. So you find this very, very prominently in AI, very prominently in the philosophy of creativity, very prominently in some sort of social epistemology of science, and very prominently in sort of business studies and places like this. We can imagine you have a problem like building a Swedish dagger. I then have a space of possible strategies, possible solutions to that. This is what the circle represents. Then within that space, there will be certain areas which have better solutions than others. So we can imagine height, the sort of third dimension on this, within this little circle here, represents how good the solutions are. And your job is to search that space and find the good solutions. Now, usually when people talk about this, these things are delineated by computational space, conceptual spaces, things like that. I think if you're doing experimental archaeology, that search space is physical. It is based on my physiology and my capacities as a lithic stonemaker and the stone tools that I'm using, right? That is what decides the space. It's not our ideas or our concepts, right? When we're thinking about someone like Boards and the sort of ways in which he is improvising and speculating within his lithic practice, it's his own body, his own habitus, and the tools he's working with that are setting the search space. And so I think it's how the material conditions of experimental archaeology give or afford archaeologists the capacity to search these relevant search spaces. They are relevant, right? The archaeologists know that they are relevantly similar, at least in some ways, to the people who made these tools in the past. They know that they're using more or less the same materials as those people in the past. And so that search space is a relevant search space, right? And so it's those material constraints that explain the productive idea generation of this experimentation, and that's why it's justified. And so we think about here as speculation in a material or embodied kind of way, not purely imaginative nor abstract. Speculation, we say, is justified materially, not on the basis of some logic of discovery or some heuristic psychology. And so, what are the epistemic goods of experimental archaeology? Notice I haven't really disagreed with anyone here, right? I'm rather adding to things. Yes, you can test archaeological hypotheses, in particular, hypotheses which are used to connect traces to their past production, those things that capture regularities, dependencies between traces and the past. But they also generate maker's knowledge, this embodied, skilled maker's knowledge. And that allows you to understand and critique archaeological work. It allows you to partake in that experimental tradition. And it allows you to generate these integrated explanations. Finally, it allows us to see that experimental archaeology, at least in the context I'm interested in it, is speculation made material. And that's my talk. Thank you.